Okay, so tonight I am with Rin Michaelis for an interesting, hopefully, discussion on some of the issues that have been floating around politics, both in the US and the UK, for the last few days, weeks, months, I suppose, in some cases. And if you want to get even further, years, centuries, there's a lot to discuss. There's a lot to think about. But hopefully, we're going to have a nice time with it. Rin, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Rin Michaelis, and I used to make regular YouTube videos, but now I don't so much anymore.
Don't we all? I've just come a bit of a hiatus myself, really. Like it's a funny thing, life. Sometimes it gets in your way, but you're back here now. You're here now, so that's what counts.
Mm-hmm. Well, I like doing this chit thing. Man, I'm having a little speech impediment right now. But yeah, me and Lapis, we used to do live streams together.
Yeah, well, I think it's quite the same for a few of us, eh? Like, interestingly, I think that this sort of thing, even though there's no professional air to it or anything, we're not sort of like some big company putting together a big debate or anything. Like the importance, just small conversations, like especially in times like these, is so important because it's easy to get lost amongst the noise of international news and domestic elections and all of that. It's so important just to have day-to-day chats and just little things here and there to keep you connected to people around the world. Because I'm obviously in the UK, you're in America. Like there's different things happening, but equally we can get the strands of politics together and think about what's good for everyone, and think about an international movement of thought and discussion. So, Rin, was there any way you wanted to start today? What's on your mind? What's the hot press thing that you want to start with?
Well, the thing that's been in my mind lately was the Israeli versus Palestine conflict, because I really couldn't escape it. You know what I'm saying? Couldn't really escape it because each and every single last YouTuber wants to talk about it. It ends up being all over my feed. So I started off with the most unbiased person that I could think of, which is Chichi McCullough. And Chichi McCullough, he tried to be fair, and he tried to talk about the pro-Israel side and where they're thinking, and he tried to talk about the pro-Palestinian side and what they're thinking. And then he said something interesting, and I initially missed it. It's like initially I missed it, but then like how we watched the video, and he said that Palestine was a British colony, and it caught my interest, and so I started to doing more research into it, but you know I'm not going to trust Ben Shapiro at all. I'm not going to believe anything that Ben Shapiro has to say about it.
As well, you shouldn't.
So it's like Ben Shapiro, no thanks. So I just looked into like what the UN has to say, and I read an old letter by the UN that's talked about the Jewish concerns and the Palestinian concerns. And it did said that they were Jewish colonists and Jewish settlers, and that's the um that's the Palestinians, wanted their own independence because they were promised their independence in 1917.
I mean, there's certainly a lot there. Like I think that with this sort of situation, given the sort of intensity of the noise there is around it, and sort of the vitriol and the alarming images too, like I think it's like you said about your feed, like it's sometimes if you search for information about this, like it can be really quite tricky because like you'll type in something and you get like really graphic footage, for instance, of like a bomb going off, or the remains of people, like, and it's like tricky because it can be quite disheartening sometimes looking at that. But I've always thought, especially with issues of warfare and violence, it's good to look past like the states and the big names and look at what's happening to people like you and I, but who live in Gaza, in Palestine. And I think because I've tried to go at it from that perspective of like, what's happening on the ground in Gaza, it's impossible for at least me to see the constant violence and the death and misery being placed upon these people, not just in this recent conflict, but for years under the sanctions of the Israeli state, and come away concluding that the actions of Israel at the moment are justified or right. And I think it's very tricky because the sort of language that we discuss a lot of this is framed in religion and in ethnicity and in sort of the legacy of lots of things that happened in the past. And it's really important to make sure that when we're speaking about it, we're being really clear and thoughtful with how we discuss things. It's important, like you say, to not just unabashedly be like, right, all of our sources of information is coming from one point of view. We're just going to take the exact words of this one person and just go with that, because absolutely, like I think some people use this conflict as like an excuse to package in their own ideas about things. So, for instance, I completely agree that like people are using criticism of Israel to smuggle in anti-Semitic arguments, or to try and make some rather alarming arguments about Islam and Judaism and stuff. But I think for people like us, we've got to be like really focused on our criticism of like what we and most people have been protesting. The senseless violence against the people of Palestine is what we don't want to happen. The violence in the Middle East, we don't want violence. We don't want death. We want peace for all. And at the moment, the biggest threat to that peace is the constant barrage of missile strikes happening as perpetuated by the Israeli state, right?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. Because when I tried to look for unbiased, news, I'm obviously not going to trust Ben Shapiro or Jordan B. Peterson or Fox News. Like I'm not going to trust anything that Fox News has to say. Like Fox News is like, like even John Oliver called them out. Called them out on the lies that Fox News is spreading. Like no. Not gonna trust Fox News, but it's kind of a lot like like I like the way John Oliver handled it. He tried to mention the pro-Israel side where Hamas did attack Israel. Like I think Hamas has been bombing Israel, and then it's kind of like it also mentioned that like, hey, like okay, here's Doctors Without Borders, and here is here is, what Doctors Without Borders has to say, and that, Israel has been bombing Gaza indiscriminately. Like
Exactly,
they have been bombing hospitals, they have been bombing the ambulance, they have been bombing mosques. Like think about all of the children that have died. I think 4,000 children have died, and 1,000 children have gone missing. It's kind of a lot like, and there's Doctors Without Borders saying stop with the indiscriminate bombings, because you're not going after Hamas military forces. You're targeting the innocents, kind of like how Israel, they cut off the water supply and shut off their electricity, all of which are war crimes, like leaving the Palestinians in unsanitary conditions. These are all war crimes that Israel has committed against the Palestinians.
Exactly, right. And I think you've hit the nail on the head there, like with the fact that regardless of what has like come before, the action is so unproportionate to what preceded it that, as you've said, thousands of children, thousands of people on top of that as well. Like even if it's, I think the of course children dying is terrible, but even if no children died, the fact that hospitals are being blown up, schools being blown up, people are just being killed indiscriminately, like is such an atrocity that it would be wrong not to speak about it. It would be wrong not to, focus the attention on the indiscriminate missile strikes, the just wave after wave of violent act, the lack of ability to be able to accurately cover it, because the UN peacekeeping forces who've gone in there have been affected by missile strikes. The media coverage, like how many journalists in Palestine have been killed because missiles are just they're just blowing up anything. Like it's such just a scene of death and slaughter that it's impossible for anything to move forward until the source of this violence, namely the state of Israel, is stopped. And then of course, like you said, Hamas is responsible for violence there as well. But you can't, when the direction of violence is so heavily weighted from one side upon the other, not just in this conflict, but in terms of like a wider overview of how Palestine and Palestinians have been treated, nothing can move forward until the main perpetrator of violence is addressed. And then from there, then of course you think about all the things that have happened around it, and of course the violence committed by Hamas should be addressed. But you've got to look at the wider picture to be able to understand where actions have come from, and the wider picture is thousands of people are dying because of the missile strikes. Like,
yeah, and it's like, so there's also the problem with Israel's history of colonialism. It's kind of a lot like most of the Jews there are immigrants. Well, they're settlers, and if I recall correctly, settling into the country, that's an international crime as well. Correct me if I'm wrong. That if you're settling into land, that violates international law. If you could correct me if I'm wrong there.
Like, I have to brush up on my international law, but certainly the actions of people, settlers in the past, have had a huge impact on what's happened today. And I think it's important to stress as well that many of the colonial powers of 50, 100 years ago had a hand in this as well. Like the role of Britain in the Middle East has been largely damaging, and many of the problems that we see in the Middle East today have can be traced back to actions taken by Britain and the British Empire hundreds of years ago. And it's the same in Africa. It's the same in the wider Asian continent. It's the same all over, right? Like the actions of colonial powers 200 years ago, 100 years ago, has a major impact on the governments and the policies and the land disputes that happen today. So of course it leaves you with a huge ball of yarn to untangle, right? Like the Palestinians and the Israelis and the different religions and all the tension you've got there. And it's not going to be easy to fix all that. Like, of course, no one's suggesting that you put in place one policy and then suddenly everything's peaceful and fine. But the way to making a start to fixing things so that maybe in the future things will be less violent and much more civil and hostile and calm is by ending the violence, ending the wave upon death, and then you can get to a place where people in Palestine and in the wider Israeli state will be able to discuss and think about what is best way to move forward. And that's the same, I think, across the Middle East, because when the entire sort of discussion revolves around like this is our land, this is our territory, increasing the amount of weapons and missiles and arms you've got there, the constant funding of sort of Western approved powers too, so like the money that the UK and the US and other countries in Europe pump into Israel's like arms and army and stuff, like gives us, it's the reason why like so many sort of commentators from our countries refuse to acknowledge any viewpoint other than Hamas are threatening Israel, so Israel have to fight back. It's like that's the only narrative that's seemingly allowed by certain elements of certainly by the government. Like certainly you look at like we, for instance, in the UK, our Home Secretary was describing the marches for peace that people were having across the country as disrespectful and as acts of hatred against Jewish people, when in reality they were across all religions and all faiths and all races and ethnicities. People just want peace, right? They're marching because they're so disgusted by what's happening in Israel, like what you said, with the hospitals being blown up and the countless dead. They want Palestinians to be able to have peace and not get blown up. And the fact that our government sort of repackages this, so you're marching against Israel because it's anti-Semitic and stuff, and the Home Secretary is quite literally coming out with this and saying this, like it shows that the discussion is going to take a lot of effort, but it has to move beyond this like violent, nasty, insidious rhetoric that is currently perpetuated.
Yeah, from what I'm hearing is that part of the U.S. supports and the I'm guessing that the British supports of Israel is because from what I've read and what I've heard, but I mean I'm hearing this from the left, but it's like because it's like they are protecting their colonial interest in that region because it's like colonialism hasn't fully gone away despite the modern rhetoric of colonialism bad. It's kind of a lot like parts of reversing the damage, of colonialism is having an honest discussion that Palestine is colonized land. And not only that, but I mean, from the UN, there it used to be like multicultural. I mean, I could try to pull up something from the UN because the UN
Feel
stated
free to
like
share your screen.
how, huh?
Sorry to get you off. I said if you've got something to show on your screen, then feel free to share it. I should be able to. If you try and share your screen, you can show what you're viewing and stuff.
Yeah, because it's like I think this is it. Yeah, because I should have learned what the Nakba is because John Oliver was talking about it. Okay, it's like the Nakba, which means catastrophe in Arabic, refers to the mass displacement and dispossession of the Palestinians during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Before the Nakba, Palestine was a multi-ethnic and multicultural society. So it looks like they got along back then.
And
it's like,
I think. You go ahead. Sorry, you finish what you're saying.
Yeah, at least when it says Palestine was a multi-ethnic and multicultural society, it seemed like they got along back then before. I don't know. Well, I don't want to make assumptions, but it seems like there was a time when they did live in harmony. And it says, however, the conflict between the Arabs and the Jews intensified in the 1930s. So it looks like the Arabs and the Jews got along before the 1930s. With the increase of Jewish immigration driven by persecution in Europe, and with the Zionist movements aiming to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. So it's like when when the Zionists tried to colonize the land, that's when the problem arose. But before the colonization, it was a multi-ethnic, multicultural society, which seems to imply that the Jews and the Palestinians did live in harmony together at one point.
Well, exactly, right? Like I think it's very much the case that despite what the Zionism is the key here, right? Like the sort of religious fundamentalist, really right-wing, really authoritarian sect within Israel that has managed to get its own sort of narrative and mindset about the world as the accepted view of like the situation, right? Like the idea that it's all their land and that the Palestinians or the Muslims or whomever they sort of dislike in terms of their own ideology have to be dealt with and are the source of violence. When in reality, as you've said, as the history of the area shows, it's a very diverse part of the world. Right? There's a lot of people from different religions and different backgrounds who have lived there and continue to live there to this day. Like I think it's important to stress as well that in Israel, it's not as though it's like just an entirely monolithic, like only Jewish people live here, only Jewish people who like subscribe to Zionism live here and support like themselves. The way things are in Israel is very complicated and very diverse, and it's the fact that elements of the government, I say elements of the government, because the current prime minister and the apparatus of the state are being controlled by people who subscribe to the Zionist mindset. These radically fundamentalist, authoritarian people within Judaism. And I think the fact that you look at the language that many of these people use, And it's so far removed from the average person in Israel or in Palestine who, like you say, and like that report says, just want to live their lives and enjoy their culture and play sport and stuff. And instead, they've had these arbitrary lines placed on them by outside forces, and been segregated and being forced to remain sort of interned in like these areas. Because like, it's important to stress as well that Gaza was it was an open wall prison, right? Open air prison. People weren't able to travel freely in and out of it. They were very much treated as though they were like an invasion force to be contained, segregated away from the rest of society. So it's not even as though it's like the entire framework around this situation has been so distorted by this movement within Israel. And I think that it's if one were to have a proper to go back to what you said about colonialism too, like it is very much a case of having to unpack the not only the history but look at how it's upheld. In terms of like a political analysis, we'd call it post-colonialism, like the legacy of colonial era structures to maintain the colonial power are maintained through economic means and through cultural means. And one way of doing that is through funding. So Israel obviously is an ally to countries like the UK, France, America. And so because of that, it gets huge investments into their military forces and economy by the Western powers I've just listed. And so even though technically, of course, Britain no longer has an empire as such, but through the economic means that it places upon others with the sort of global economy, it allows its power to go into countries that it wants to uphold, like Israel, and then through that keeps a seat on top of the global economy. And you can see this in Africa, in countries like Africa, where the economic conditions placed upon them will require, for instance, a certain amount of their national industries to be privatized, to be sold to American, British, sort of French companies from abroad. And if they say no, they will they'll have sanctions placed on them, that they will fail the economic tests that the World Bank or the IMF place upon them, which make them liable to regime change or to be declared undemocratic. And then the West will sort of place in charge someone who is more open to liberalization of the market. And when I say liberal, I don't mean like how I don't mean liberal in the sense of like right wing, left wing, like one's sort of better, one's bad. And so it's not like liberal versus conservative. It's liberal in terms of freedom of the market, free capitalism to do as one pleases as such. In this case, opening up resources of the country to be made sellable on the market for a profit for corporations to buy it. So lots of companies have got massively wealth by outsourcing their industry and their financial generation of resources to countries that were once former colonies of Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, and they're making a massive profit when said cheap production of goods is shipped back over to the West and sold at a much higher rate. And so that post-colonialism is countries in Africa, for instance, that have much lower GDPs, that have much poorer economies, don't have as much financial independence, have to rely on loans from Western Western countries, therefore become beholden to those countries and aren't able to generate enough financial independence all to make and maintain the financial wealth of America, France, Britain, and so on. And so even though there's no empire anymore, those countries are still beholden to the Western powers that sit atop the economic tree. And that was a lot to say in one go there, so I'll let you say so for a second.
No, I was hoping that you would talk more about how we sanction other countries to get our way with them.
Okay, so so international politics like maintains, generally speaking, on the whole globe, they it follows the rules of free market capitalism, right? So like, even though there are some countries that don't necessarily have that system, so like typically when someone says, "Oh, think of a communist country," you might have said the Soviet Union 30 years ago. You might say today like North Korea or Cuba. And obviously, as someone who is fairly left-wing myself, I wouldn't agree in such, because like the tenets of communism or socialism or whatever, most of these systems rely on worker-owned control of state goods, of national goods. Sorry, so like worker control of the land, the water, the transport, all of that and stuff. And so even though like in those countries you might say like the state is in control, if the state is not, not only would some disagree that the state should even be there in the first place, but if the state is not democratically controlled by the workers, the people who control and operate these goods, then you can't really call it a worker-controlled system. So one might say that Kim Jong-un and his party don't represent the people in an adequately democratic way, therefore aren't like a communist system as such. But that's getting off the point. In the sense that like the globe operates on a capitalist system, right? Like you sell goods for a profit to try and boost your own economy. You try and generate money through this system, and you raise money above others to get yourself into a like good economic standing. But because this system relies on the sale of goods and making a profit, for you to make profit, someone will have had to have been shortchanged, right? Like you have to make a profit over someone for a profit to have happened. Like you have to have outsold someone, or you put more money into your economy than other countries. And so the framework that is in place for colonial powers like Britain, like France, like America, to maintain this power. So for instance, slavery, a big one for America, for Britain, the transatlantic slave trade made huge profits for European powers at the expense of most places in Africa, at the expense of people, the indigenous populations. All this money that's generated through this allows them to put in place the economic system of capitalism, to the modern system we have today, but maintain the same power structure. So if you have more money than these other nations, your profit is going to come by maintaining this money, by maintaining the capital you have, the resources you have. And to expand your empire, you can buy up land in these less wealthy countries, take control of the resources, and then keep in place your power. So like if you, let's say you're growing a crop in, I don't know, let's say Nigeria, for instance, big African country, one of the wealthier countries in Africa, but still most people in Nigeria do not live a life that you would say is perhaps above the, like other a standard we would consider above poverty. Let's say like there's a lot of poverty in Nigeria. 100 million people live there, probably more than that actually at this point. You have control, let's say, of lots of agricultural areas. You have control of much of the working populace, because you need to be able to work in capitalism to be able to afford the food, housing, clothes you need, all of that. So you've got control of the economy because it's all privatized. You therefore can control the direction of all those goods and what they're used for. So if all these goods are being sold overseas, so the energy production, the goods you're producing, the food you're producing, if that is all being sold for cheap to a company off in America, let's say like Walmart, for instance. Walmart is a big retailer in America. Walmart then sell these goods to the American market for a much higher price than they bought them for in Nigeria or in other countries. They now make their billions to maintain their place as a massive American company. Meanwhile, the guys in Nigeria have been paid next to nothing, right? Like the economy in Nigeria does not receive the same fraction of the wealth that's been generated through this transaction as those in America. Therefore, when it comes down to the next cycle of spending, who's going to have more money to spend? The American corporation or the Nigerian corporation? And if you multiply this by several thousand times, because obviously there's more than just like Walmart's not the only company that exists to operate in Nigeria. You've got many, many more, and in Africa in general. Like there's loads, because you have such a like domino effect as such of like so many corporations from America, Britain, France, and stuff doing this. The means for like a a bit of independence from this system for nations in the poorer parts of the world is are massively reduced. There's not the same ability to be able to do that. Like, and so I think because when people say colonialism, like I think the image you immediately get is of like men with soldiers firing rounds at the indigenous population and be like, right, you must do this right now. Like, of course, it isn't quite as literal as that, but the same effect that means keeps its place. The resources are being controlled and directed by powers in the West against the wishes of people in the actual countries this is happening in, because they're unable to economically get a foothold in the same system. And so the balance of power remains in the court of the Western powers, and specifically the Western, we're talking like the corporate elite and the companies with the money to be able to do this, who maintain their power. They maintain their place.
Yeah, I'm listening.
I'm trying to probably sort of garble that a little bit, but like you've got essentially the exploitation that happens like within a country. So like, for instance, a Walmart, of course, pay millions of people in America to work for them, but the conditions they face will be exploitative. So they get paid a very small amount of money that isn't even enough to live on, because their rent, when you factor in a person's rent and their food needs and their energy needs, like it's not enough, right? Like they're going to have a pretty tough life a lot of the time, and or just scrape by, like just about enough to survive, barring they don't have any medical crises or anything serious happen to them with their property or anything. And that's amplified in these countries that are affected by the former colonial territories and stuff, because they, at least in Western countries, like because we've got wealthier economies, we are able to afford more liberties, which I should stress were won through lots of labor actions and striking and workers' movements. They weren't sort of just given to us as such. They were fought for and won. But in countries with poorer economies that are sort of at the bottom of the capitalist pyramid, these nations don't have the freedom as such to choose what they do with their resources. They don't have the same economic muscles to be able to spend on world-class education or world-class transport or world-class resource management. They don't have the same power. And so because so much of their economy is controlled by overseas interests, they're then stuck in a cycle. They have to spend their money in what little money they have on a few places, often their capital cities. So for instance, Lagos isn't the capital of Nigeria. It's Abuja, I want to say. Abuja. But I don't know, I keep going back to Nigeria. Let's pick Ghana now. Accra is the capital of Ghana. Accra probably has lots of nicer buildings and more like a more urbanized, more like traditional view of like what a financial center would be. But the further outside of Accra and major cities you go in Ghana, the worse the provisions will be, because the same investment isn't there to to have like a modern economy, to have the same luxuries we enjoy in the Western world. And so because that the opportunity of like the opportunities you have are lower, the labor that is seen there is largely going to pull back towards manual labor and work that's like very physical and often in farms and in sort of primary forms of like work and stuff, which obviously all go towards the same companies which control it, which keep the jobs largely in those sectors, which stops the economy from broadening, which keeps the country in its place as a tool to make money off for wealthier nations elsewhere in the world. So that the sort of the flow of capitalism stops there from not only from being change in those nations, but keeps the nation on top subjugating these poorer nations and stops them from ever really wriggling out of their grasp. So even though lots of people in the rich nations will say, yeah, we hate colonialism, we're giving new opportunities to these smaller nations, there's not that ability for it to ever materialize into anything beyond maybe a few rich people from those nations maybe appearing in a Fortune 500 once in a while. Like, if you're really wealthy, then absolutely, like, it's better now to be from those countries. Like, you can be from any country maybe, and like, yeah, there's going to be some, of course there's going to be some discrimination, but in a purely economic sense, if you're wealthy, you can leave and invest and have a nice life. But you know, if you're, let's say you're just the average person in Nigeria or in Ghana or in any of these countries, like, your ability to spend your money and ability to actually be a free person in the sense of having choices and having a access to all the luxuries of modern life, you know, they're much more limited. And that's the real point of talking about post-colonialism, you know, the legacy of colonialism. Even though the chains are gone, the illusion is, you know, upheld. The problem is still there. It's the capitalist problem now, rather than a strictly empire-based system of like 100 years ago or so.
Oh, you could go on.
So I think, oh, that's a bit zoomed in. Hold on. So I think that you know, like, it's when we talk about like, you know, post-colonialism too, like, it's easy to think about how, like, when it's like when I'm sure you'll probably hear it more than me, but like, you'll talk about racism and some say, oh, well, slavery ended all these years ago, why are we talking about it still? Why doesn't matter? But the angle that we're talking about it from isn't literally of like someone with a whip trying to like get you to pick cotton or whatever, like, as the, you know, as the racists like to imagine. It's about the economic forces that are still in play, and the way that laws and policies are bent to the capitalist system to be able to make them maintain their power. So, for instance, when, like, it's quite a British example, but like when emancipation happened, it wasn't as though every single, like, you know, white person accepted that, you know, races were all equal, and that, you know, slaves were going to be able to do all things they could, and that things were going to be perfect. Soon after that, lots of people in the southern states where slavery had been, you know, the way, put in place policies that protected the wealth and the land of, you know, the former slave owners, and stopped black people from gaining, you know, the ability to do these things and to vote and to be able to pass laws and go to schools and all the things that make you more educated and make you more able to get a foothold in capitalist system, right? Like, be able to own land and start a business and all of that. And these are Jim Crow laws, right? Like, so the ability to vote in elections and to hold down jobs, and where you can work and what you can do, and all of those things that give you access as the societal functions, is blocked for people. And obviously it takes decades for us to, like, in the South, like, it takes literally almost 100 years to actually stop most of this from happening, right? Like 100 years until Civil Rights Act. You know, the Civil War ends in what, 1860s? My American history is not amazing, but it's around the 1860s, right, when the Civil War ended.
I'm not entirely sure.
So, you know, let's find out when the American Civil War ended. But I know, you know, it's roughly the 1860s, and the Civil Rights Act was 1963. I want to say maybe 68.
I think it was 1969.
Yeah, 69 was in First Land of the Moon. 68 the Civil Rights Act. It's probably one of them. Like, we'll go with what you said, 69. But at least it's around 100 years, right? So, you know, if you're born when slavery ended, you're waiting 100 years before, if you live in a southern state, to actually be able to vote safely. And then that's not the end of it, of course, because, like, not only has, you know, racist white people in these states been maintaining their power through the economic advantages they have, which, let's not forget, in capitalism, like, if you've got the money to be able to make more money, then you're going to get ahead of people who don't have that starting money. Like, the resources you have are always going to generate more for you than people who have nothing. They're putting in place more things to maintain their power. So, you know, like the incarceration of people, like the increased policing, the higher and lower rates of tax, the rates of investment, the ability to be able to put new buildings and businesses, where new businesses and new places of investment are put in an area. Like, so for instance, in lots of cities in southern states in America, the more affluent, more like sort of economically diverse, wealthier parts of the state will be where more white people live. Meanwhile, the inner city areas of like southern cities will have much less investment because it keeps it poorer, keeps it from ever overtaking the more affluent areas, ever having more spending power. Look at how districts are like voting areas, for instance. There's millions of black people in the South, millions, but because black people don't tend to vote for racists, and unfortunately lots of people in the Republican Party are deeply held the same beliefs that were held in this time, like it's against their interest to allow for a fair voting block. So what they'll do is they will draw up a district that is like sort of wraps around the entire black populace, or like majority black areas, into one voting block, and then split the majority white areas into several voting blocks under the assumption that most of the white people there will be voting Republican and win their seat and maintain the flow of power. Wealth inequality is huge in America and in the UK and in most capitalist nations. Obviously, it varies from place to place, but generally speaking, where the market has been more capitalized, turned into like privatized, opened up to capitalist expansion, generally we see wealth pool into the hands of a few. And when you combine this with the racism that has been waged upon people by colonial powers for centuries, when you recognize that racism and capitalism have had a huge, they've gone hand in hand almost, like the wealth generated from slavery made the West rich. The wealth generated from colonialism and the expansion of empire made us the wealthiest nations on the planet for centuries. When you combine the two, you can see how both they have like a mutually beneficial relationship. Racism keeps capitalism on top. Capitalists use racism to justify paying people in the third world less money to do the same job as people they were previously hiring in the West. Hence, for instance, sweatshop factories been placed in countries like Bangladesh to generate huge amounts of money for the same amount of labor, but paid at a minimal price. You might have seen, in fact, it's quite a common headline. You'll often hear stories of like factories falling apart in Bangladesh, quite literally killing people in the factory whilst they're working. Horrible headlines, really unpleasant stuff. It's a common occurrence because not only do those countries not have the money to invest in their infrastructure, the policies that would need to be put in place to ensure that all factories are like, of a certain safety, all working conditions are healthy and stable and going to give everyone a living wage, would reduce the profits of the companies that owned them, and therefore make less money for the West, and then weaken that power structure, and therefore they don't get put into place. The politician that says let's make our factories fairer is up against it sounds a bit cliche saying the establishment, but they're up against the capitalist system that has put in place, or has failed to put in place, fairer working conditions, because ultimately it's less profitable if you have a safer factory because it costs more to make. And it's a bit ironic, really, because really, if we think about it, a society where everyone had a fair and safe way of living, had access to food and shelter, and had the right to be able to work in a safe place, would be more productive, right? Like if everyone had the opportunity to, like engage in society, then all of a sudden you've got more people who can think about things, who can get a good education and can expand upon, what you know already. Imagine if, Albert Einstein could come from any country in the world. If the great minds of the of the world that we think of when we think of like Isaac Newton and James Watt and all these amazing people like Charles Darwin, like you got all these great minds. Imagine if you didn't have to have like an advantage based on where you were born or what class you're in. Like imagine if it was available to everyone. Of course, like the world's going to improve and get better, but instead resources are controlled by such a small section of society that you have to have had all these like pre-built-in advantages. Like obviously we're both black, right? Like we're both black, but when we're born in countries that largely, through the efforts of workers of course, but like largely have more civil liberties and more protections in place, and we don't have a serious risk from the places we work at. Whereas if you're born in Bangladesh, in India, in Pakistan, in large parts of those countries, the same protections aren't in place, and your ability to be able to, get to the same economic status or the same ability to like have a stable life are much, the odds are much less for you. Like if we were able to reach a system that didn't have all these pre-built in advantages and disadvantages, these pre-built in inequalities, there's a far stronger chance that the world can improve and that people can enjoy better lives. And it's about, for certainly for me, but like for a lot of people, recognizing that for us to have a better world, there has to be serious systemic change. Now, of course, people have different ideas as to how much you have that systemic change and where you need it and stuff. And I'm a pragmatist. I'm someone who very much thinks if you can do something good right now, then definitely let's do it. Like, I'm not suggesting that just like that the whole world changes instantly. Like, of course, it's going to take time, but by looking at the more left-wing option, looking at where we can change things somewhat, it's my view that eventually things can get better overall. And that I think brings us nicely on to talk of social democracy, and the sort of how that links to capitalism and how it links to socialism and how sort of all of them have their place in the world. Did you want to say something about that?
I mean, I'm not real read on social democracy, but I did score social democracy on that 9 points axis test, but I'm not actually well read on it. It's just what I scored on a test.
Well, that's all right. Like, what about like your thoughts on obviously you're an American. If you look across the Atlantic, you get to see Europe. What's your perspective then? Do you think on like how European countries, certainly the ones in the west of Europe, differ from the American system, and where you see potential for change, or what could be better, do you think, or worse? Like,
oh, are you asking me how America could be better?
Yeah, like so obviously you're an American. Like, what do you think is a fault of like your life in America? Like, let's say, like what do you interact with that like needs improving? Perhaps would be a good place to start.
Well, if you're asking me how life could be better, then I recall, being a huge fan of T.J. Kirk, and he talked about the Norwegian prison system. And I do think America would be better if we had a Norwegian style prison.
That's a great place to start, actually. So the I think we mentioned it briefly when we were talking about colonialism and stuff. Like, the prison system at present has many faults, certainly in America. I would say in the UK as well, in lots of countries, in that it's so entirely focused on the idea of punishment as the one thing, right? Like the idea that you've been bad, put you in prison, throw away the key, you've got to suffer in there. And there are so many approaches to criticize this from, right? Like, so the idea that just punishing someone's going to fix anything, like, is one that leads to a violent and more nasty society anyway, right? Because like if you're fueling anger, then you're not really going to fix anything. You're just satisfying a very primal want, and it just leads to more and more violence, as evidenced by the fact that as a deterrent, it's not really working. People still commit crimes. People still do terrible things. Clearly, prison is just some place to dump angry people. It's not a good way of fixing things. Secondly, prison, as a concept, like, is a huge cost to society. Like, the amount of money it actually takes to run prisons is massive. And when you combine it with the fact that most people in prisons aren't there for things that like equate to being put and locked away. Like, it's easy to imagine prison as this really necessary thing if you have like the most dangerous, violent, like, we like to sort of dramatize like serial killers or mass terrorists, but proportionally they are a fraction of the prison population, right? Like, most people in there are there for things like theft or maybe like an assault or something, but like it's not like it's a crime syndicate or like a mass like bomber or something. Like, most people are in there for things, but if we are actually to analyze it, there are different factors why they're there. We could talk about how people are the products of their environment. And like, if you, rather than looking at a punishment, instead look at how they got to the state where they've done something that is wrong. So let's, for instance, look at the education system. Why do they not have the schooling to be able to get like the qualifications they need to access the job market or access the resources and stuff around them? And it's because their schools aren't being funded. Their schools have a fraction, a tiny budget. They don't have the resources to be able to manage children who maybe don't have the skills to sit down and be still for a little bit, who haven't had the home life to be able to access reading material, access mathematics stuff. Like they need more input and stuff. Because the schools don't have the budget to do that, lots of children aren't able to access it. And that inability to access gets them frustrated. That frustration leads to frustration from the school. The school telling them they can't do things gets them angrier. The anger has nowhere to go. And then you end up with children who become angry adults who do something that perhaps is wrong, of course, but rather than being given help for it, they're just instantly arrested, put in jail, sent to prison. It's also worth considering a lot of people in prison are not even like convicted of anything. They're there because they couldn't post bail. So you post bail. Let's say you're put in prison. The judge is like, right, okay, costs a certain amount of money to post bail. If that person's already come from a family of like low economic status, then the money that you need to post the bail is not going to be there. Like, most people can't just whip up thousands of pounds off the cuff. So you're then taken straight from the courtroom to prison. You're there in prison until the judge hears that the trial's heard, right? So you're there for an indefinite amount of time. Like, you don't know when you're going to be out of prison. The prison itself likely isn't like, let's go back to the Norwegian stuff. In Norway and in Scandinavian countries, you have like prisons which are about rehabilitation more. Like there's things in place for you to do whilst you're in prison. Like maybe you can do a course, maybe you can get a job of sorts, maybe you can work on your fitness, things for you to do. In some prisons in the UK and certainly in America, it's like you're putting yourself for most of the day, you've got nothing to do. When you're let out of yourself for recreational time, you're interacting with people who've just been kept inside all day. So their anger and their energy's got nowhere to go. They get really cross. They end up in fights and in arguments. You get gangs in the prison starting because because that threat of violence is there. Like, you end up with people thinking, well, we're going to get attacked, right? So we've got to stick together. That then fuels more. Because there's nothing to do in prison, you get like lots of drug usage, because if you're sat in a room all day and you've got nothing else to do, you've got nothing to interact with, like, of course people are going to turn to drugs. That fuels further violence. That makes it a dangerous place to work. The attitude of the prison officers then becomes, well, why are we going in here unless we've got more to do? So give us more remit to beat the prisoners and attack them and stuff. That fuels further violence, and it gets worse and worse and worse, when instead it should be about rehabilitating people. Like, you want as many people as you can able to be in society. So if someone has done something wrong, you want to help them. I think, again, people think that, like, I think films like Silence of the Lambs, for instance, do a bit of a like disservice, because they have put it into the mind that, like, if you try and help prisoners, they'll just like trick you into letting them go free and like you'll never see them again and stuff. In actuality, most people, like, they would probably, if they were given the tools to like help themselves, not just from like straight in prison, but like throughout their life, they're going to have a better chance of being able to engage with society. Most people aren't monsters, funnily enough. Like, there's no like the tools that have made them into someone who's committed a crime need to be unpacked before you can just say, right, it's time to put someone in prison. Like, I think as well, what's scary is that, especially in America, and to somewhat in this country too, prisons are a tool of maintaining profits and power, which might seem scary because, like, obviously, if you're imagining that prison's just for bad people, then it's like, well, they're in prison because they're bad. But certainly in many urban areas in America, it's operated on almost like a business model, right? Like, the judge makes money for how many cases they see. The police officer makes money based on how many arrests they make. The prison gets more money for how many prisoners they've got there. So there's a financial incentive to fill the prison with as many prisoners as you can. Hence, then you have police officers. There's obviously a big conversation about policing in the US, but many officers will deliberately cruise around lower income areas for looking for crimes to arrest people for. So jaywalking is a crime in America. Loitering, things that could be quite easily solved with some less radical things than just arresting someone and putting them in a cell. But there we go. Economically, people steal things because they haven't got the means to afford it, right? So you hear lots of stories of people being arrested for stealing like baby formula or nappies, and like, yeah, sure, they stole something from a shop. Yeah, they might have been a bit aggressive, but like, you've got to think, if they had the means to afford it in the first place, would they be doing that? Like, if they had access to all these goods they need to survive, and often it's their family that they need to help survive, like, would they be doing these things? And of course, like, there's an argument about whether that's the right route to have taken. But in desperate times, people do desperate things, and targeting people exclusively for those things instead of putting the money into investing into cities and investing into areas and redeveloping them, like, leads to overly populated prisons with no real direction for what they're going to do for prisoners. So then they end up just with people stuck in the prison with no real direction for them. Worse is when companies like to go back to Walmart again, and like McDonald's and stuff, put money into the prisons, but not to actually help the prisoners, to give them a job. But the job will be like a fraction of minimum wage, and not at all equivalent to the proper paid wage. Whilst to help, like, for instance, make uniforms for McDonald's workers, or to peel potatoes, or to package goods. And these jobs again go towards making money for higher ups of the corporation, make the companies their fortunes, but at the expense of prisoners who've been paid less than what they need to survive on in a prison. So they didn't really have a choice as to whether they could get this job or not. And it's like, it's maintaining that system of power. It's maintaining that flow of power. I think prison really needs to be part of a wider discussion about how people exist in society. And the way you have less people feeling like crime is their only option is by investing in education, in housing, in healthcare. Let's not forget therapy. Lots of people would benefit from talking over their problems with a professional, being able to discuss things, like have a route for their anger to go down. So, for instance, like a person that is proclaimed to anger and to fits of rage benefits more from discussing these feelings with someone who's trained to help them than they do being arrested, thrown in a cell, and put in prison. Because ultimately, if that anger isn't addressed, what's to stop that person then being just angrier when they come out of prison, or angry in the prison? Like, there's got to be a route for that to go down. There's got to be a way to channel it out. So yeah, I think in countries where they've got more social prisons, where prison isn't like some holding place, but isn't like some cell, but like a settlement, like maybe like a controlled like set of houses that you might see like in a little green area, where it's obviously away from like built up areas and the rest of society, but like they can still go and walk around outside. They can still like go for a run or play a game or something. Like, they've got time to exist. It's just, it's managed. They've got tasks to do, and maybe they've got to go and see like a professional, but they're still human. They're not put in like a little cubicle of a cell and then told to wait for 50 years until they're allowed to go free. It's a much healthier system.
Yeah, I agree, but there's something you said earlier. It's like I don't think jaywalking is illegal. I think it's just let's see, it's a minor infraction. Let me see. Jaywalking is considered an infraction or minor violation of the law. The penalty for jaywalking is usually a fine or a written warning, and not only that, but I don't know anybody in my area that has been punished for jaywalking. Like, there are people who are jaywalking in my neighborhood and nothing happens to them.
Well, that's fair enough, I suppose. But it is, as I understand it, you can still be like spoken to by the police and cautioned for it and stuff. And I think that's where a lot of the offences end up originating from. Like, so let's say officer comes to you and like sees you doing this, and they're like, why are you doing that? And obviously you might not necessarily know you've done something wrong. And if we combine that with the factor of that unmoderated anger that a lot of people feel, that sort of dissatisfaction, that loss of sense of direction. Imagine you're one of these angrier people who has, no, angry is the wrong word, someone with, maybe untherapized rage and anger, like you're frustrated at stuff, and that officers come over to you. And let's not forget that officer is looking for an arrest. They're looking for a reason to arrest someone. And so they're like, what are you doing? And you might be defensive, right? Like you might be thinking, well, what's he speaking to me for? Like, so maybe naturally you're a bit scared, a bit confused, maybe even a bit cross. And that perception of how you acted in that moment is then taken as, oh, well, they've got something to hide. We better search them. And we better say something to them. We better maybe even tell them to stay still. All these things contribute to a further worry in the person who's potentially going to get arrested here, potentially looking to get spoken to. They don't know what's going on. And some people are going to react quite negatively to that. Some people might run. Some people might shout back. Those instances where the anger has risen to a point that is maybe a bit of shouting, maybe a bit of frustration, maybe something that's beyond just like a civil conversation, is turned into an excuse for the officer to use force, make an arrest, restrain someone. You got to think as well that the officer in question may be affected, may have like some thoughts that are affected by racism. So like you look at how lots of black people are policed differently to white people, not just in the US, but in the UK. We have stop and search policies in the UK and a lot of places. And what ends up happening is like random young people from urban areas, so like in London, Birmingham, Manchester, like they'll be stopped disproportionately compared to white people. And yeah, like it's going to be quite scary for imagine if you're like a teenager, let's say, like you're still in school, and you're being treated like a criminal by people who are supposedly there to protect you. Like, and it's a scary thing. And a lot of people, when they're scared, are going to react differently to when they're just like in a conversation. So that might mean running away. That might mean shouting back. That might mean like, getting a bit aggressive. But, you got to think, is that equivalent to then the reaction that comes from that, which is getting arrested, getting put in a cell in jail, appearing in front of court, maybe. Perhaps if you're lucky, you get let off. If you're unlucky, as is the case in a lot of places, especially in America, the judge is like, well, we're going to have to hear this again. Off you go to prison. Like, wait till your trial day. You're in prison now, so you're then in the system. And especially when I think it's also important to consider that even in the logic of like this, punishment is through prison and stuff, lots of these prisons, especially in the UK at the moment, aren't funded properly. So the means to actually having a sort of fairer system where maybe you do have more resources out of prison to manage what's going on there aren't there. So like there's less officers, certainly less experienced officers. You then end up with a prison that's like, just ran primarily on like violence and disorder. So the guards are only trained in like restraining people or like having fights and stuff. They're not trained in de-escalation. They're not trained in like people skills. They don't know how to interact with people who are maybe more likely to get angry and to fight and stuff. They don't know how to form relationships, because like if let's say you are like a convicted criminal, you're serving a few years in prison, like you're going to be there for a long time. So like you might think that in a healthier situation, the guards and the people who are there would understand, like they'd know them, right? Like they'd get to know them, maybe even have a decent, like not saying maybe best friends or anything, but like have a proper, like be able to say like hello and good morning and stuff. But because the guards like are increasingly just there to like pin people against walls and like hit them with batons and just like shove them back into their cell, there's just that culture of distrust and violence and us against them, which leads to prisons being very unsafe, which then it's a cycle, right? It just increases the flow of things. And to go back to that kid on the street who's been like arrested for, maybe not for jaywalking, but for the reaction after it, the resisting arrest and all of that, like that fear of the system is part of what makes the system worse, because you imagine you're afraid of it, you're going to be more likely to have a hostile view towards the authorities that uphold it. So the courts, the police, the judges. Like, it's a deeply flawed system. And ultimately, the system that improves, if you want to have less people committing crime, you've got to look at why the crime happens, how the crime is dealt with, how society reacts to it. And it's got to change from the ground. So better schools, better healthcare. If people do commit crimes, then better means of dealing with those people. Really, I think prison as it exists today, where prisoners are basically given no like freedoms of rights, should only be for people who are absolutely a danger to society. So we're talking like the most serious of like serial killers and murderers and people who are like, if people who like, would be actively dangerous for others to have like around in society. So like the most heinous and awful crimes should be like kept in maximum prisons. And then if you're someone who has done something maybe violent, but like needs to, if you were like violent once, you should be in a space where you can like discuss it and talk about it in like you say, like a Norwegian style prison, where it's like you've got space to do stuff, but you're being monitored and stuff, and you're in a space where you can rehabilitate. And then I think some crimes, like for instance, if you have like someone who's committed tax fraud or something, like what's the point? There's no point in sending them to prison. They should have different things based upon them. So like, maybe their credit card, they can't spend a certain amount. Maybe they can't own certain things. Maybe they're not allowed to book plane tickets all of a sudden, like to, to try and escape with their money and stuff. But there's no point treating them like they're some like bomb threat or something, because their crime wasn't anything to do with violence. It was, like fraud, right? So they're not going to beat someone up or attack someone. They're just someone who has been irresponsible with money. So their punishment shouldn't be one that impedes upon like half their human rights. It should be one that stops them from doing the same thing again, and maybe prohibits their ability to do the same thing again. Like, here's another one. If I have, let's say I was a professional athlete, which, it's not going to happen, but, one can dream. Let's say I bet on myself to win a race, or around. Let's say I bet on myself to lose a race, and then I lost that race, and I'm suddenly like I've got £100 million. Like, if I'm found guilty of that, then what's the point of sending me to prison and treating me as though I'm like an active danger to everyone in society? Like, the reaction should be to stop me from causing the same, same level of harm. And ultimately, the harm wasn't one that endangered people. It was one of monetary means. So now the punishment should be like, you can't spend that much money on things again. You don't have the access to do those things. Not one that puts me in a little cell and treats me like I'm like a ticking time bomb or something. Like, it's got to be more measured. It's got to be a more humane and sensible approach. And I think that's what's missing ultimately from the system at current.
Yeah, I mean, you could go on.
Well, and that's like, I think going back to that point of like prison being such a link to the rest of society. If we look at like education or housing, we can make that link back to capitalism and why there's that serious fault there. So like education, schools, for instance, are such an important part of how people end up where they are. So if you're like a child in an inner city school in a really built up city, like, your economic opportunities are going to be hampered by the fact that the school you've gone to is likely not receiving the funding it needs to support you and the hundreds of other kids who are going through the school at the same time. So in lots of schools, the textbooks haven't been updated. The actual building itself is often quite old and unstable, falling apart in some cases. In my country, lots of schools had to be shut for a period of time because of the unsafe materials that were found in the schools. The fact the infrastructure was falling apart. Lots of buildings have not been updated in a very long time. The staffing is an issue because they don't have the money to pay for the support staff and the teaching staff to be able to manage all the children in terms of their not only their educational needs but their safety as well, right? Like if you've not got enough staff and there's lots of kids there, like there needs to be that it's going to be unsafe. And the reason for this is because it's the profitability of those schools is seen as much less. It's a case of managing resources in a way that allows the wealthier parts of the country to maintain their wealth, to maintain their power, and to keep inner city areas from ever reaching that wealth, to keep the power divide from one end to the other. And so because of that, the schools that we see in these areas don't have funding, have children who have a host of educational needs that don't go met, and that frustration and that tension that comes from not being able to access the same educational materials ends up being manifesting in rage and anger and frustration. And you often hear people talk about, like, I don't know, falling standards, or how like kids these days don't know what they're doing, all that sort of stuff. And firstly, it's like people have said that for generations, but secondly, it ignores the fact that the reason lots of these schools are like this isn't because there's some innate problem. Like you get a lot of like racism in this sort of section where it's like, oh, well, black people are dumber, so they produce kids who aren't as good, and blah blah, all that sort of racist stuff. Like the actual reason that a lot of schools in inner city areas struggle is because they aren't given anywhere near the same funding as their similar schools in like richer areas of the country, and that's UK and US. And because they don't have, and because around that, they don't have the same healthcare quality, they don't have the same access to healthcare, they don't have the same infrastructure around them, so like libraries and parks and sports opportunities and all of the stuff that you need to have like a healthy society. The funding's not there for it. They don't have access for it. There's less ability to do things as like a person to enjoy, and so that frustration and that anger ends up channeled into it has to go somewhere, right? Like you can't just stay bottled up inside you, so it ends up being expressed in unhealthy ways, so in violence, in crime, and all of that. It's important to remember as well that these people who do these things aren't just like evil as such. It's like the economic factors to be taken into account as well. Crime is largely influenced by economics. If you don't have the money to afford your rent, or to afford your food, or to just do things in society, then the allure of being involved in crime is going to be higher. And then once that's started too, like if you've got individuals in your neighborhood who are like doing this, then it's harder just by proximity for you to be like able to live a less criminal life, even though you might not have any interest in being involved in that. Like if you some of the most violent areas in the UK, in like cities in the UK, so like in London, in Birmingham, in Manchester, they're not like inherently criminal because of the people who live there. It's all those factors I mentioned a second ago, plus the fact that once you're in that cycle, unless there's serious economic change to like the wider system around it, it's hard to break the cycle. Like and when you factor in as well the like cultural elements too, so like if like a lot of like with like sports teams, for instance, like if you I don't know if you follow sport at all, but like there's a rivalry, for instance, between I'm trying to think now, like so this is so hard. So like Liverpool and Manchester United, two football teams from the UK, they're a big rivalry. They don't like each other in the sense of like they want to beat each other. They're sports rivals, right? But that rivalry is going to keep on going on and on until one is either much bigger than the other, or there's like a stop to it, because the rivalry is there in place. It's like it's built in. And so similarly, because of that, like that urge and thrill you get from rivalries, you see lots of rivalries form in inner city areas because they become a thrill, right? There's something that fuels you, that keeps you going as a person, that innate sort of need to be a rival of sorts. And so because of that, I think what's the term, post-Cold War is a thing that's thrown around in London quite a bit. But because that's built in, because of the conditions that have caused the crime, it's like it's hard to unpack all of this sort of built-in problem without thinking beyond hard to unpack it without thinking about a wider economic change, like a wider wider change to the conditions that have been in place there. So funding for all those resources that a society needs, hospitals, schools, libraries, parks, sports centres, better transport, better business opportunities, just more things put in place there instead of the decay that's seen in lots of these places. And ultimately, that comes through social control of social goods, worker control of these goods. Because at the moment, if you're one of the wealthier entities in society, your aim is to maintain your wealth under the capitalist system. If you're talking about making as much profit as possible, making as much money as possible, like what incentive do you have to invest in these areas, but for your own opportunities? So like you'll have like investment, but like it's very like coordinated, to obviously only be available for some people. That you need a certain amount of money to get into it from the up-goes. Like if you like put a little shop somewhere and those shops are only selling things at a certain price, then already half the neighborhood's priced out because like they can't afford the stuff you're selling, right? Like they can't actually access most of it. So you get some like quote unquote philanthropists who will like try and say they're doing a good thing, but like really it's quite all like co-opted to like a certain direction. Whereas the actual change that would benefit everyone there, that could be felt by everyone, is more likely to come through socially organized causes. So like things that are controlled and owned by the people who live there themselves. A public park, a public sports area, a library, things that the community themselves can put their efforts, energy into, can get invested in, can feel the benefits from. Like another thing that is an issue with just like billionaires investing in these areas is that they, by nature of it, receive some money back from it, right? Like it's part of their wider sort of expansion of business. Like they're just trying to make more money. And even if some money's going back into the community, part of the money that the community helps generate is disappearing off into some bank account somewhere. Whereas if the resources are publicly owned, if it's like stuff that is for the local good, the city good, the national good, things that are controlled and democratically owned by workers, then you can control what happens with it. You can shape it, independently of like some moneyed businessman somewhere. So it's good to link it back to the criminal element. Like if you have communities that are able to be self-governing and have the democracy that they need, then the anger and the frustration that's felt would dissipate. People who maybe struggle with education get the help they need, can channel their frustration into sport and into recreation, and can actually do things that aren't going to be causing harm. And further on down the line, the prisons have less tension because there's less people just coming in and having nothing to do, and all that violent stuff's going down. Prison then becomes a place for more serious actual like crimes that would happen regardless. So like people with issues that sort of are independent of like financial circumstances around it, and they can get the help they need. Like it benefits everyone for a society to be democratically operated, to have less capitalist influence on it, and to be more equal, more equitable, more fair for everyone.
What are your thoughts about how people talk about male loneliness, but in the sense that male loneliness causes men to join gangs?
That's an interesting thought. It's interesting. I did actually have a discussion sort of similar about to what you just said with a man called David Sharat, which is on my channel if you dig through the archives. Don't recommend doing that totally because there's a lot of stuff there, but I shake my head at. But there is something there you can have a look at. But I do think that there's a good point there. So the lack of connections that one faces in a modern economy where so much time is put towards working, so much time is put towards just making money to be able to survive, that you end up with not enough time for socializing. Maybe when you're when you've got time to do things, your friends or your peers or your community are also all working, so like you're less connected to them. The capitalist mindset of making money and getting better than everyone else and being the top dog and stuff makes you naturally more cynical and more competitive and less friendly towards people who should be like your peers, right? Like you're inclined to try and compete with people instead of working together with them. And so that makes for a community where you're less connected to people, you're less mutual with your friends and your neighbors, and by in turn you're more lonely. I think that in terms of like gangs, obviously more gang members are men, and so it's easy to sort of look at that as male loneliness, but I don't think it's. I think loneliness is endemic to everyone under capitalism. I think that the alienation of people under the current system is a thing that affects everyone, and that gang violence is just one expression of this frustration. And that's not to excuse gangs, because of course, like, it's not good that people are being violent towards others and are making their neighborhoods an unsafe place to be. But it is still an expression of this frustration. If you speak to, if you were to have an interview with like one of the people in these gangs, like they're not going to be like, yeah, my dream is to like, carry a knife and go around stabbing people. Like, they're still a three-dimensional person with wants and needs and beliefs and family, and like it's far more complicated than that. It's just that their frustration and their tension has been channeled into this specific form. Lots of people have the same frustrations, but it either doesn't realize itself in this form, or ends up in a other form of harm. So maybe they end up with like a mental illness. Maybe they end up dying prematurely because the stress of working a really tough job for long hours for not much pay gets to them. Like lots of people have heart conditions, lots of people have high blood pressure. Like there's lots of health effects that we sort of don't associate with the way our economy works, which actually would be linked back to it, because it's a really serious thing. Like if you're working all the time, that's going to have an impact on your well-being. Lots of people as well, I think, forget that obviously violence is like we sort of tend to think of it immediately as like fighting and of like really testosterone filled, and yeah, that's going to skew more towards men. On average, more men have more testosterone and are more proclived to impulsiveness and violence in that sort of form. But that's a result as well of our sort of the centuries of how we've gendered things in society. Like violence also exists in other forms. Like let's not forget that because the mind is part of the body, how the mind reacts to things and how the mind makes us think can also be interpreted as violence. And if we think of how families can fall apart and how our friendships can fall apart and how people can be snappy and angry with each other in society, that can also be interpreted as a form of violence. That can also be interpreted as disharmony and social incohesion. And ultimately, that is expressed by everyone, even though more men are in gangs than women. Like violence in society exists through many forms, which can also be, starving someone from food. People who like, if you need food to survive and you're blocked from getting that food, that in some sense is a form of harm to the body. That's a form of damage that's being done upon you. Lack of housing, lack of shelter, lack of warmth. All of these things are still huge problems in society that people face. And the fact that we sort of focus on the violence of some people, from poor areas versus the violence inflicted upon everyone by this system is a sort of it's a poor framing, in my opinion, because it doesn't actually adequately reflect the nature of the problem. Like we, I think in terms of like we say, like loneliness affects everyone to varying degrees, in the same way that people react to problems in society in different ways. But if you think like, take London. London's got about 8 million people living there. Not close to 1%, 0.1%. I'd say like barely a fraction of the population of London are in gangs. Yet most people in London live in or in close proximity to the living wage, right? Like they getting by day to day. Most people in London are not millionaires. Of course, prices are high in London, but most people in London do not live the life of luxury, do they? And it's the same in most cities. Most people live month to month, paycheck to paycheck, and an emergency in 1 month is going to have serious implications for their ability to be able to continue paying their rent, or maybe they have to choose between paying their electricity bill or going a few days without eating a meal. Like that to me suggests that the problem is not the gang as such compared to the wider violence of capitalist society, the wider problems with access to things in society. And that's where our focus should be, in my opinion.
Yeah, you could go on.
Well, I would, but my voice is starting to get a little bit. I'd take a quick swig of water. Did you want to say something quickly?
Yeah. I don't know. You have an interesting take about whether, well, like how you were talking about how loneliness could manifest itself in different ways. Like if you're working really long hours, you know, that could, manifest this way in like high blood pressure, I thought that, you had an interesting take because, I do think I recall David Shrett talking about how male loneliness could lead into joining gangs because the gang could provide a sense of brotherhood and they could end up being like a surrogate family.
Yes, 100%. Like 100. That's a really good point, actually. Like, so it's easy to forget that, as well as the sense of, the thrill of doing something and the anger that's there, there is that sense of needing some connection of any kind. And if all the other institutions and social fabric has been like stripped away because it's not funded or because it's been cut or because it's just not there in the first place, then of course the warmth of anyone is going to be accepted. And so, excuse me, whilst there's still that, a lot of people sort of, if you ask them, like they're not going to be like if you ask them why they got into gangs as such, they're not going to say like, oh yeah, I wanted to be a criminal. They're going to say these are the people in our neighborhood that like were around. These are the people that like offered me a place, spoke to me, chatted to me, played with me. Like there's a reason that a lot of gangs, for instance, like sort of skew younger. And it's because that sense of community that young people need to be able to flourish and to grow and to become healthy adults isn't there. And so the structure that they're given is, like an organization like a gang where you've got people who are going to buddy up with you and stuff. And then you're going to either will yourself or you're going to be willed into doing more and more serious things. It's worth as well pointing out that not all gang crime is like strictly murder and stuff. Like a lot of it is going to be petty theft, and it's going to be like selling drugs, but like not in the sense of like hard class A like international crime syndicate drugs. It's going to be like just maybe selling a bit of marijuana. Like maybe it's going to be just selling painkillers. Like it is not always going to look exactly how you see it in like crime dramas. And the fact that it's all policed the same way, like the person who has stolen some chocolate bars from a shop is going to be treated by the police in the same way that like the person who's just stabbed someone is going to be treated, like makes the problem even worse. Because like a lot of the problem is that younger members of these gangs who perhaps have been like groomed into joining the gang as such by older members who are clearly still school age kids who need the support to be able to choose differently and think more about their own choices, are like being manhandled and violently arrested and thrown in prison with like grown men. And like you don't solve anything by doing that, because all you've done is like all you've done through that is like reaffirm all the us versus them like rhetoric that the older members of the gang will have been telling the younger ones, like until they're hardened themselves, right? Like if you treat someone in such a way that they're scarred by it, then they're going to end up having an impact on them. I think as well, the fact that getting a criminal record leads to such headaches for you in the future. Like, it almost blocks off the opportunities apart from the gang in some respect. So if you are, convicted of a crime and sent to prison, there are many jobs you then can't do. There are many people who will not give you the time of day. You won't get hired. Technically, there's some, you're not meant to discriminate, but like, if it says you're a criminal, then like your chances are you're going to be blocked from like certain forms of housing, certain places to live, certain jobs. Like, and so if you can't get any of that stuff, then what's there waiting for you, right? Like the comfort of what you've been doing already is going to be quite like reassuring for someone who is barred from all other opportunities. And that's not to say that it's impossible, because of course people leave prison and turn their lives around and have a better life. But unfortunately, recidivism is quite an issue. Like, people do end up sometimes going back to their former lives of crime. Not to mention people who die from what they've been doing, and then it's done and they can't do anything else. Like, so like, to go back to loneliness, like, and what you were saying, it's absolutely the lack of community that they have previously is replaced by the gang being their community, and their delinquency coming through the need for connection, through the strain that's been caused by wider society pushing them into the warmth of others. So no, I agree. Like, it is a factor.
I'm sorry, it's a bit loud over here. Do you want to continue? It's kind of loud in my end.
I'm speaking too loudly, or is it like the?
What did you say? I can't hear you anymore.
Oh no. So can you hear me? Is it my microphone that's not working, or is it there's background noise for you?
Yeah, there's a lot of background noise on my end.
Okay. I'll read to paraphrase what I was saying then. It was just like, the gang becomes a community, and the reaction to the gang can sometimes make you feel more close to the community, like as a result, right? Like, so the fact that criminals can't get much once they've stopped being in prison, the fact that people get treated brutally regardless of what position in the gang they're in, the fact there's not much provision to help people who are in gangs to improve their lives, makes it much harder for them to choose something other than the life they already know. And combined with a previous discussion about how social provisions are cut and replaced and stuff, and you've got a pretty tricky situation for people to get out of if you're in a gang.
Because it's loud here, I just sent you a message through chat because it was just really, really loud all of a sudden. And, my question was, okay, the noise is kind of going now, but it's like, do you believe that anger management could help? And by that, I mean, in schools, in American schools, I'm quite sure in English schools, you have sex education, and the justification of sex education is that you're going to need it all your life. So it's kind of like, if you need sex education because it's going to be something that you're going to do in most of your adult life, then shouldn't there be anger management implemented in schools?
Yes, 100%, and a billion percent. Like, I think it's a really good point. Again, the anger that you see in a lot of these gangs and stuff, like a lot of these sort of criminal subcultures, comes through not only an inability to process it, but an inability to channel it anywhere. There's no outlet for it. So I completely agree that anger management would be a huge benefit to many schools in inner city areas and in schools in general. I think no matter where you're from, being able to like work out how to manage your emotions and how to channel frustrations and act as a person in society with many different challenges and quandaries to face, it's also important. I think the fact that schools, this I think we'll have to have it in another conversation at some point, because we've just gone past 90 minutes of this stream. But I think the fact that schools aren't given the freedom to do this because of how the education system sort of is a wider conversation here to be had about how schools are used as a means for producing children suited to the needs of the capitalist market. But it will take a bit of time to go into, but also we'll focus strictly on the anger management part of it for now. The schools don't have the time or funding to actually put in place like almost not quite therapy as such, but like sessions of emotional reflection and sessions of thinking about how to manage oneself, and therapy for the children who do genuinely need like extra help beyond that. And so because the school doesn't have the means to do that, they aren't able to help the other children as much, who would benefit from this more. Those children get angrier. The school's response is often just one of punishment, of like putting them in detention or taking away their lunchtime, whatever. That makes them get angrier. That exacerbates the problem further. It becomes a cycle. Whilst this is happening, that anger is not often given an outlet for it. There's no outlet for that anger to go. Like there's nowhere at home for it to go, nowhere at school for it to go, and you end up with like an incident, like maybe a violent lash out or some form of reaction. And in that moment of reaction, you reach a crisis for that child. Maybe the school says, right, you're suspended for a bit. Maybe there's some consequence at home, like you've lost this, and the child is lost for a bit. They're feeling alienated. They've lost some sense of normalcy. Perhaps they've even been kicked out of school, so they've lost their community. And that's when the replacement happens, right? Like the gang that might exist in their neighborhood is there, and they're got nothing else to do. They've got no other place to let go of their emotions, and so they get drawn towards that. They have new friends now waiting for them there who are in the gang, and at that point they're more easily able to fall into negative behaviors themselves. Like if the school had an anger management program that was adequate, if they had resources to manage it and to be able to help these children, instead you would see children who are angry be able to give in a space at the school or at in their life to be able to be angry and not face the consequences for it, be able to speak to someone who could handle it, be able to air things that they wanted to say without fear of like getting told off or shouted at. And not only does that help a child feel better about themselves and feel they've got a space to talk about what they need to, but it would help them manage that anger further in future situations, make them less likely to fall into crime, make them less likely to do the wrong thing. Like they're able to be a better person through that. And it's so obvious that this could be put in place, but I think most people would be able to would want this put in place. But unfortunately, because our economy and because our public spending is controlled by market forces, and because the money is not allocated for it, the school can't put it in place. They're given the choice between putting that in place or cutting their maths department or cutting their ownership of like the land the school operates on. And ultimately, in today's economy, certain things matter more in schools, and so a lot of schools don't have the ability to put in place those emotional well-being programs that would be really vital. So no, it's a really good point, and I think it does. They do need to be put in place, those sorts of schools programs. Sorry. I reckon we should try and head towards a bit of a conclusion, because if you've got background noise happening and the call's coming up to 100 minutes now, so as enjoyable as it has been, I kind of have to do part 2 on education and further stuff on that at some point.
Oh yeah, because I was just thinking, like, we were talking about anger a lot, and so I was thinking, because I mean I've been believing this in a whole lot, because it's like there are even adults with anger issues. There are definitely adults with anger issues. You see anger issues a lot in the workforce. And to me, it's kind of like, liberals would often say we need sex education, because sex education is something that you're going to be using most of your adult life. Then it makes sense to have anger management like when you're young, because okay, there are even school teachers with anger issues. There are definitely school teachers like I've had at least one teacher would like about 1 or 2 teachers with anger issues. And like there are people who lose their jobs There are
Hmm.
people who lose their jobs because of their anger issues. So, learning about how to manage your anger at a young age, it's not only going to benefit you while you're young, it's going to even benefit you, when you're older. It would perhaps even lead to healthier marriages, healthier relationships, healthier friendships, you know, because anger management would teach us how to be better human beings and how to treat each other better. Like it would be, if I'm angry with you, I don't get to cuss you out. Like if I'm angry with you, I'll still have to treat you with a sense of dignity and respect instead of just like, well, I'm angry at Owen, so I'm going to cuss him out and I'm going to slap him in the face because I'm angry with him. You know, I don't get to be angry with you and then, starts keying your car or taking an axe and starts cutting your tire. It's like I'm angry with you and just be like, hey, Owen, that thing you said to me the other day, it's really hurt my feelings and I'm really upset with you because of what you said to me the other day. So
Exactly right.
just,
Like communication is so key for having stable, healthy lives and relationships with anyone in society, and that's got to be learned from throughout your life.
mhm.
And if school is where we send people to learn, then it's got to be part of where we learn. It's got to be a part of the daily routine, weekly routine. So no, it's glad that you're saying. I'm glad that you're saying that, because I very much agree. Like if you go through life just being angry, then you're going to lead to conflict and tension and ultimately worse things happening in life. And to stop that, got to be put in place from there. But I think we'll wrap it up there. We'll have to definitely talk more about education next time, because I think you've definitely got a lot to say about it, both of us. But no, it's been really interesting having this discussion with you. I feel like it's been nice, just being able to touch. I think the fact that both sides of the Atlantic have got such similar thoughts and from different perspectives, but similar conclusions as such. I think shows that there's a lot of stuff that can be discussed, and it's really interesting to do so with you. So thank you for coming on.
Oh, no problem. Anytime. Mhm.
Well, that has been another fruitful discussion. Hopefully, we'll do some more in the future. Don't know when, but it's going to happen at some point. And stay subscribed to me, hopefully, to watch more. It sounds ridiculous even saying.
Yeah, I'm still subscribed to you.
I'm the wider audience, Rin. I know you're still on the channel, but I'll try and link Rin's channel so you can have a look at our stuff as well. Thanks for watching, everyone, and we'll have to see you all next time.
Bye bye.